Well, thanks everybody so much for taking your lunchtime to join us for this webinar. My name is Keith Thompson. I'm the Private Lands Program Manager with Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation. And I work out of the Montpelier office. Been doing this work for about 10 years. Prior to that, I was the Chittenden County Forester for a while and was a consulting forester for some years prior to that. So as folks know, this is a webinar for the Minimum Acceptable Management Standards Revision. It's a landowner webinar. And today's presentation is we're going to do an introduction of what the standards are. We're going to discuss some of the background of the standards, discuss some goals for the revisions. We'll do a high-level overview of the changes. We won't have the time today to get into the details, but the goal of this is really to equip you to look at the draft standards and understand what our goals were, what examples of some of the changes were, why we were looking at some of those, and highlight some of the ways that we intend this change to improve the program, but also help you consider how it's going to affect you so that can inform your feedback to us on them. So the goals of today's discussion is to share, well, what are the standards in the first place? Why are they changing? And what is changing? And what are some of the potential impacts, both to you as individual landowners, but also more broadly to the program as a whole? And so recognizing with 30 different folks in the room today, there's a lot of specific circumstances. There's going to be a lot of good questions, but there's also a lot of content to cover. If you could put your questions or comments in the chat, if we do have time at the end, and we've got some more time for questions and we're calling on folks, I'll ask folks to limit their comments or questions to a couple of minutes so that we can get folks in. With that, we'll get rolling. So the minimum acceptable standards for forest management apply to managed forest land. So land enrolled in the program can fall under, and land enrolled in use value appraisal program can fall under two big categories, either agricultural land or managed forest land. And managed forest land is the category administered by the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. It's the overarching category for forest land enrolled in UVA. It includes land managed for saw timber, sap production, old forest, wildlife habitat, and more. Managed forest land is managed according to the minimum acceptable standards for forest management. That's consistent with statute. It's also managed according to a forest management plan approved by Department of Forest Parks and Recreation. And so, as I mentioned, managed forest land is the overarching category. Beneath that, there are several subcategories. The most common category that folks' land is enrolled in is the productive forest land category, but there are other subcategories. Commonly, Site 4 lands, think wetlands, open idle agricultural land, think meadows that are brush hogged, things like that. There are also ecologically significant treatment areas. That was a subcategory created around 2010. You can think riparian areas, like areas along streams or lakes. There's also old forest or natural community, ecologically significant treatment areas. These are areas that are managed for the protection of the resource, of the ecological value of that resource, as opposed to managed for saw timber. There are two other big categories, subcategories. Reserve forest land was recently created, which has some unique eligibility criteria, but this subcategory is managed for old forest characteristics. Only certain properties are eligible in that subcategory. And then there's conservation land, and there's only a couple hundred parcels enrolled in this category. This is eligible exclusively to 501c3s. Think Nature Conservancy, Vermont Land Trust, or other nonprofits in the business of conserving land that own the land in fee. Like I said, there's only a couple hundred enrollments in this category as compared with 16,000 more broadly across the program in forest land. These changes that we're discussing today don't really address or consider the conservation land side. We're focused on these others that are much more common and applied across the state. So what are the minimum acceptable standards? And the reason I'm raising this is because this is one of the mechanisms that guides and supports administration of the current use program. There are others. So think statute establishes the foundation. The legislature passes a statute that establishes the program as a whole and creates other authorities. Within statute, the minimum acceptable standards for forest management refer to certain standards established by the Commissioner of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And throughout statute, it refers to managed forest land being managed consistent with these standards, and that forest management plans are consistent with advancing this kind of management. So specifically, these standards define the form and manner that forest management plan submissions will secure approval from Forest, Parks, and Recreation. They describe what forest conditions must be present to be eligible in the subcategories of managed forest land, and they describe how enrolled forest land must be managed to maintain eligibility. The last most significant updates to the standards were in 2010, so about 15 years ago. We've learned a lot in the program over the last 15 years. There have been some other changes to the standards in the interim and to statute that we're looking to integrate into this new revision, and I'll touch on that more in a little bit. What don't the standards cover? The standards don't cover what the use values are. And so when your land is enrolled in the program, there's a use value that your land gets taxed based on, as opposed to the fair market value. And so in 2025 for forest land, I believe it was $188. These standards don't touch that. That's determined by the Current Use Advisory Board outside of these standards. These standards don't cover overarching eligibility or qualifications. For instance, the statute states that for 25 acres, or in order to be enrolled with managed forest land, you need to have 25 acres or more. Statute establishes that requirement, not the standards. It doesn't address the fact that landowners need to submit forest management activity reports the year following a forest management activity, or that land needs to be managed according to a forest management plan. Statute covers that, as well as the requirement that parcels be inspected by the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. Statute also establishes the land use change tax and the appeals process. Those are outside of these standards. And finally, the administrative procedures, think like the application timeline, what you need to do to apply for the program and demonstrate eligibility at the time of application. Those are aspects that apply across the program. They're coordinated by the tax department. They're not unique to forest land, and they're not covered by these standards. And so I want to just get clear about what we're changing, what we're not, and to give some examples from the 2010 standards. And this is not the full picture, but just some examples. So overall management requirements, the 2010 standards include a requirement that production of high quality forest products on a sustainable basis shall be the primary focus of management efforts on all enrolled parcels. Another says that all taps shall be removed annually at the end of each sugaring season and before a full leaf out. And finally, it's the obligation of the landowner to ensure that soil erosion and or stream sedimentation does not occur on any lands enrolled in the program. So of course there's much more than this, but I just want to kind of provide some examples of the nature of some of these standards that are incorporated in the 2010 manual, many of which are carrying forward, some of which are being clarified or amended or removed in the revised standards. Another big part of the standards relates to the details of the forest management plans. Of course, land that needs to be managed to in a certain way also needs to be described and the management prescribed in a way that creates shared expectations that the management standards are being met. And so some of that requires explicit detail about what isn't going to be included in a plan to describe the forest and how it's being managed. Examples of these are that sampling data must be stand specific and accurately represent field conditions. So sampling data is the data that when your forest management plan is prepared, forester goes out, measures some trees, gets an average diameter on trees, looks at density, looks at species composition, and this is referring to that. Total basal area, for example, needs to be provided for all stands of pole timber and saw timber sized trees. And finally, in prescriptions in a management plan where activity is being prescribed for all treatments, provide species favored for retention and regeneration and residual basal area objectives. Again, these are just examples of the kinds of things covered by the standards and what is being addressed in the new revision. Taking a step back and zooming out, there's a lot of land enrolled in the program. There's about 2 million acres, about 16,000 parcels. There's a lot of diversity among landowner objectives. There's a lot of diversity among the parcels enrolled in the program. There's a huge amount of benefit to individual landowners and to the state through this program. At the same time, there's a big corresponding workload associated with administering this program. And so a lot of these revisions are trying to strike a balance of maintaining the value for landowners, the flexibility, the connection that they have to their land, and the degree to which they're able to advance their objectives on their land, that are also very supportive of the goals of the program, that it's protecting resources and advancing the forest economy aspects of the program, and providing equitable taxation at the same time as it being reasonable to administer. It's a lot to keep track of and to support folks in. So the costs and the benefits of use value appraisal. So the program, there's about $76 million in total tax savings to enrolled landowners. And this gets viewed in a lot of different ways. This is tax savings. This is just tax equity. It's also sometimes viewed as a cost, particularly when we're dealing with challenging education budgets and so on. There's always some look at this. And this last legislative session, and I expect in the future, won't be any exception. The degree to which this is a worthwhile investment in the state is also related to the degree to which it advances its purposes. And there are many purposes for this program, and I'll go through some of them. Conservation and preservation for future productive use. We're talking saw timber, forest economy aspects, and for the protection of natural ecological systems and services, including water quality. And back in the 70s and 80s, when this program was originally conceived of, there's a lot of things that take on new meaning as we look at this, and the role of this program in supporting water quality, particularly in light of the flooding that was occurring in 23 and 24, or maybe even as we're dealing with in terms of drought right now. Our forests and the way we protect water quality is particularly valuable coming from private land. Also, the role in the program in preventing the accelerated conversion of these lands to more intensive use by the pressure of property taxation, the role and its value in preserving and enhancing Vermont's scenic natural resources and to assist in climate adaptation and mitigation, and to enable citizens of Vermont to plan its orderly growth in the face of increasing development pressures in the interests of public health, safety, and welfare. So these are just a few, and there are more purposes for the program. But as folks look at the significant price tag of the program, it's also really important for us to be able to say, we've set up the program in a way that ensures that these purposes are being met and that landowners' goals and values are being met individually on their land, and is providing value to them as well in an affordable way. In terms of administering the program, the county foresters, there's 13 of them. They handle the forest land aspects of the program, and in the program, each of you have needed to submit a forest management plan at some point during your enrollment. Many of you have probably, updated your forest management plan at some point. Plans need to be updated once every 10 years. And the county foresters review approximately 2,000 forest management plans per year. And many of these plans are 15 or 30 pages long, providing a lot of detail. And each individual landowner is saving thousands of dollars per year in their taxes. And so there's some cost for sure in administration. There's also some real tangible benefits for the program. But in addition to that, the county foresters are doing between 750 and 1,000 inspections on properties enrolled in the program, and responding to about 1,500 amendments of forest management plans or properties transferring hands and so on. And so it's a lot of administration, and figuring out how to reduce that workload while maintaining integrity of the program is one of our challenges, and we'll touch on how we're doing some of that here. But right now, there are existing standards, as I mentioned, last drafted in 2010, and approximately 25% of the forest management plans that are submitted by plan preparers are returned for edits, that they don't meet the standards. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Can be oversight on the part of plan preparers. It can also be lack of clarity on the part of our existing standards, creating some ambiguity about what exactly is required. And we're looking to address some of that in our revisions. And here's an example of that. This is a section from our 2010 standards on the left that is describing what's required when a silvicultural activity is prescribed. And you don't need to worry about all the specific details, except that each one of these sections in orange is a specific separate requirement. And so from a plan preparation standpoint, it gets really hard to sit down and write a plan and say, I know exactly what's required in this situation when the standards are written in this way. And so on the right-hand side, what we've done is, this is an example from our draft standards. We've broken out the individual standards in a way that is mostly replicating what is already required, but it's breaking it out into separate requirements so that it's clearer both from a plan preparer standpoint and from a plan reviewer standpoint what exactly is required. This is going to create, our goal is to help make it so that plans can more consistently be prepared in a way that meets the existing standards, and that they can be reviewed efficiently, and that they can be reviewed consistently. With 150 consulting foresters preparing plans throughout the state, we estimate that there's 200 different formats for management plans, and we've got 13 county foresters reviewing these plans. That degree of variation, while it has some value, can create some real challenges to a consistent, efficient process. that can also create barriers to getting to the important stuff, which is the work on the ground, and getting in the woods and building understanding about what's being implemented on the ground. Here are some examples of variations in the prescription format that when our staff are reviewing forest management plans, bouncing from one plan to the next, looking for the different requirements within an individual plan that might be found in really different places. And while it might all be present, the work it takes to find it can take time, and sometimes, unfortunately, it may be present, but we don't see it, and we return something for edits, which creates a lot of frustration between plan preparers who did what they needed to do to meet the requirement, but it wasn't clear how they met it, and that can create some challenges in processing things. There's another example of different approaches to meeting the same existing standard. Another example of challenges that we're navigating is that the way that some of our standards were written, they appeared to be individual standards, but in fact they were embedded standards within one. So here the standard under 11 is site class. Within this, it looks like one standard, but within it is both the soil type and the site class itself. It's actually two requirements for information. Beneath that, stand cover type is asking for a cover type for an individual stand or an area of trees, but it's also asking for the percent species composition by basal area. And so that's two requirements under the same requirement. And so in the new standards, we're breaking this out, and it appears to be increasing the number of requirements. And in some cases, there are some new requirements, but in many cases, it's just being more precise and explicit about what is exactly required, so that folks are on the same page. Another example here in how we're changing things is that the existing standards don't prescribe a format. And I showed some examples of that, and that creates a real challenge in finding the required information, ensuring that it's all provided, and so on. And what we're looking to do in the revision is create more of a template structure so that there's a consistent format, and plan preparers will be able to adapt this. They'll be able to include additional information as they see fit, or that might be valuable for a landowner who has specific management objectives. So people can always add additional information, but when they're preparing plans, they'll need to provide the required elements in the order that they're written, as opposed to kind of combining them all into the same prose or paragraph content. It will help structure it a little bit more clearly. I mentioned that the standards were last updated in 2010, and that was embodied in what we called the UVA manual. That is on the web page that's been shared that folks registered through. That 2010 manual is the main body of our standards, but it's not the full body of our standards. And between 2010 and today, there have been a lot of changes. And some of those changes are the result of statutory change. Some of those changes are the result of, for example, COVID, or need for clarification. One example is in the 2010 standards, the requirement that every plan have an original signature of all the landowners meant that the signature page of a plan was circulated among all the landowners, and they had to take a pen and sign off on it and before sending it to us. And that added a lot of time and work, something that created a lot of frustration even among those administering the program. But when COVID hit, it became really clear that we can't require people to, be sending around a piece of paper and getting a wet signature on every document. And so we began to allow digital signatures, which was in conflict with the 2010 standards. But we created the standard to allow for that in the moment. But in doing so, we create a little bit of a conflict between one standard allowing digital signatures and our 2010 standards. Another big example is that in 2023, the reserve forest land enrollment category was created and statutorily, and we created a big body of standards that described how this enrollment category, which requires management for old growth characteristics, how parcels would be eligible and how those would need to be managed. Because there were a lot of things already out of date with the 2010 manual and we were on a time crunch to meet the statutory deadline, we had to develop those standards in parallel, kind of as an addendum to the 2010 standards. But you can see this bulleted list on the right. There's a lot of additional standards in addition to the 2010 standards that are really important, that folks are accountable to, but that are outside of the 2010 standards. And that creates a challenge both for landowners and plan preparers, as well as our own staff who are trying to administer the program and make sure that folks are meeting all the requirements. It's really time to clean the slate, and the revisions in part are intended to do that. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of parcels enrolled in the program. They've got a big impact on the state. They're hugely beneficial to advancing the goals of the state in terms of what it needs from forest land, but there's a big administrative workload, and the integrity of the program depends on the program both advancing its purposes and being administered reasonably. And over the past several years, we found that there are some big opportunities to improve on that, which we think is going to make it more viable and sustainable to manage the program, and its continuity is going to really benefit individual landowners. So the goals for these revisions are to bring in the disparate standards so requirements are more easily identified, to improve the format and indexing of the standards, of the requirements within the standards themselves to allow more efficient reference of the standards, to increase clarity of the standards, to reduce back and forth review. This can reduce cost for landowners when we've reduced the back and forth review, to create a template format for more consistent review process. And one thing I haven't mentioned is to set things up to advance potential self-certification. Self-certification is a concept that was began getting floated around after the licensing of foresters became law in Vermont in 2016. And the idea is that licensed foresters and foresters who have demonstrated that they've got the professional credibility and knowledge to know exactly what is required of the standards, that they can prepare a plan and self-certify it as meeting the standards without every one of the 2,000 forest management plans being reviewed by FPR. Right now, our standards are not precise or clear enough to for anybody to be certain or confident that the standards are met every time. And so we're looking to kind of lay the groundwork and satisfy some of the prerequisites that would be necessary to lift up a self-certification program. And a big part of that is a really clear set of standards and requirements for forest management plans that somebody can review and be accountable to themselves. And that's necessary. That kind of clarity is necessary because it's really important that even if self-certification does become part of the program, that it doesn't undermine the integrity or the public trust in the program. And so we need a set of standards that can help support that. Additionally, and I alluded to this, that we need to adapt some program elements to advance the statutory purposes consistent with shifts in practice of forestry and sound stewardship. So since 2010, there has been an increasing awareness of the challenges we're dealing with in terms of invasive plants affecting regeneration of our forests, the impact of browse pressure from deer on the regeneration of our forests, the intensity of storm events that are creating disturbances and knocking down trees, and creating the need for the forest to and its ability to regenerate, but also the rain events, the intensity of rain events that are washing out roads, both our major travel corridors, but also our woods roads and trails within our forest, where folks haven't implemented practices. We're seeing a lot of lost soil, a lot of lost roads, which has both an environmental impact and a really significant cost for landowners. We're not looking to change standards with some of these, but create better descriptions so that they can be better considered when doing planning. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process for updating the standards or the manual. To date, we'll talk about some of the high-level changes that are being made, and then the process going forward. So in the summer of 2023, FPR kind of pulled together these standards. This was right after the reserve forest land category was created. And we said, we got to clean the slate. We got to bring these all together under the same umbrella set of standards. And so we compiled all the standards. And in the fall of 2023, there's a private lands advisory committee. It's comprised of consulting foresters and some landowners. They identified some manual updates and components and established a subcommittee to work on this. And through several subcommittee meetings, they developed a draft for a revised set of standards and released that to the consulting foresters in January and February of 2024. There were about 90 consulting foresters, and remember, the consulting foresters or the licensed foresters are folks who are preparing the vast majority of the forest management plans and supporting landowners in the implementation of their management activity and adherence to the UVA requirements. And so they've got this really broad view of diversity of management goals, some of the realities that landowners are encountering, some of the objectives that folks want to be able to make sure that they're advancing on their property in parallel with the timber management goals required through the current use program. So they provided about 450 comments on a draft set of standards. That draft set of standards is on the website. It's the January 16th draft. They provided comments on that. And in 2024, we had anticipated moving a little bit more quickly than we did, but we had some rollover with county foresters and needed to do some redistribution. And so during 2024, we slowly incorporated the comments from the consulting foresters. And in May of this year, we reconvened the Private Lands Advisory Committee to have some subcommittee meetings to consider how the department incorporated the comments and refine how it addressed those to get to a second draft for public comment. And so in the first draft, we focused our public comment through consulting foresters. In this draft, we've made a big push to engage landowners. I'm really glad you're here. We had another meeting last night with about the same number of people, and I think many of you probably received the email from the department to landowners enrolled in the program about this. And so we're getting a lot more input from landowners, which I think is really valuable. So we completed the second draft of the standards in July of this year and released them on August 13th of this year. So this is a second draft. It's better than the first draft, and we still want to make it better. We're already thinking and looking closely at some aspects that are we know could be a lot better than they are. We want more input. Today's one opportunity to provide input. You can feel free to write comments in the chat as you know them, but you can also use this just as a time to get more informed about what we're doing and provide input via email to me. Outside of that, I'll put more details we've got some more details on how to do that. We're going to be accepting input on this until October 17th of this year. If folks want to call and discuss anything with me, you're more than welcome. My number is 802-498-5169. I'd be happy to discuss any questions you've got or thoughts. So what is different about the standards? I'll move through these quickly. The FAQs also touch on some of these, but looking at the clean draft from August 12th, 2025 is where you can really get into the meat of what's there. The standards and the format and the standards format and the process. So the table of contents, there wasn't a table of contents, just being able to look through the standards and understand where different sections or relevant aspects of the requirements are is a big change and big improvement. Having a glossary, we've got a lot of different terms, some of which are technical. It can be helpful to interpreting the standards, both for those subject to the standards, folks enrolled in the program, but also for administering the standards, creating a consistent language that we're working from to say acceptable management standards mean this, basal area means this, is going to be really helpful. There is a clarified process for aggregating forest management plans when enrolled parcels are combined into one. There's a clarification on how to amend forest management plans outside of a management plan update. These are all really common processes that landowners navigate, and there's been a real gap in both the process and procedure for doing that in a way that maintains program integrity and is really efficient and easily navigated by landowners and their foresters. So we made improvements there. We've got some changes in management requirements. So we formalized the structure of the enrollment subcategories to increase clarity of applicable requirements. And what this means is, as I described at the beginning, there's managed forest land, this umbrella category, and beneath that there are enrollment subcategories. There was some reference to that in the 2010 standards. We've done a better job formalizing that to make folks very clear about what's required, or to help folks be very clear about what's required and when, and how land is being enrolled and what folks are accountable to when it's enrolled in that subcategory. I think that it doesn't constrain people's options, but it does clarify what's expected when they're enrolled in a certain way. And that clarity of expectations, I think, is beneficial for everybody. So we've also modified some specific management standards for some enrollment subcategories. For example, in the sugar bush enrollment subcategory, we've clarified that it's required to properly dispose of tubing, recognizing that we've got a big expansion of sugaring in the state over the last 20 years. And in some cases, we're seeing entire tubing setups abandoned and left in the woods in the program that's inconsistent with the purposes of the program. And so we want to create some accountability to dealing with that trash appropriately. We've streamlined some technical mapping requirements for reserve forest land to reduce some of the costs associated with enrolling in that category. I skipped one bullet that's an important one, recognizing that there are some challenges with deer browse and invasive plants, some of which is avoidable and some of which isn't when implementing management. We've clarified the implications of unsuccessfully regenerating a stand after treatment, recognizing that the purpose of the program is to maintain and manage forest land. There's a certain amount of risk in implementing management, and that risk can be mitigated in many ways, but sometimes that mitigation incurs some costs, or the profit margins can be shrunk when implementing management, and that can create potentially at times an increased risk of failing to regenerate a stand, and that can affect eligibility under very specific circumstances. And so we've detailed how that would work. Another important one is clarifying the process to convert forest land from one enrollment subcategory to another. Some folks can be enrolled in productive forest land and enroll in reserve forest land. Some cases it's just a change of description and of conditions and management objectives. In other cases, if somebody's changing from productive forest land to agricultural land or open idle agricultural land, there's actually change in cover and implications to management. And so the standards clarify the conditions under which that can occur, and to some degree the limits to which that can occur, recognizing the purpose of the program is to maintain forest land in many respects. Another big area I've already mentioned is the plan format. We've created standard plan sections. We'll cover some of those in a little bit. And as I mentioned, requirement to provide plan elements in a specific order for ease of plan review. So what is different? The cover page. So the cover page is the area that basically describes whose plan this is, what parcel it applies to, etc. We've added a plan acknowledgement statement, basically that the landowner is committing to adhere to the plan, some details around power of attorney, preparer info, plan date, and things like that. And so these are really helpful for understanding what the plan is, who's involved with it. And we were able to remove ortho photo number series. It's just a detail that isn't adding value at this point to that part of the plan. The parcel overview portion of the plan is a section of the plan that is describing the broader characteristics of the parcel or the management objectives. And so we've included here a treatment schedule that aggregates all the different treatments across the plan so that a landowner knows what they're accountable to for the coming 10 years. We've added an AMP implementation table, and this is one of the big changes, which is going to help identify if there are areas of the property where, the AMPs are practices that help ensure that water quality is protected on land enrolled in the program, or on forest land across the state. And it has been required, they have been required to be implemented on UVA enrolled properties for a long time. So the requirement that the AMPs are in place is not new, but the evaluation of the degree to which they're implemented is new. And we're including it here because of the flooding that we're seeing, because of the rain events and the erosion that we're seeing. It's, as I mentioned previously, this isn't just an issue for water quality and environmental health. It's also a major cost for landowners when the AMPs are getting missed and they don't have water bars in place, and we get a major flood event and they've lost their main access road. It can be tens of thousands or more dollars to repair those. And that loss of infrastructure is a huge personal cost to landowners. It's also a real infrastructure loss to the state and the program and our ability to meet the program goals of active forest management and stewardship of our forest land. We need those roads intact, and we need to prevent the water quality damage that results from their loss. So we've got that table included, making clear that we need aquatic features to be mapped. That's existed in the past. We're stressing that, and including some contact details to make sure that we're able to coordinate with landowners about what's required or missing or so on. In the past, we've had some missing information that makes it hard to connect with landowners enrolled in the program. So as I mentioned, we've clarified some of the soil and water aspects. We did remove some recreation aesthetics, cultural resources, and general wildlife habitat narratives that were part of the previous standards. Some of these were optional. People can still include them if they choose to. They're not prevented from including them. but they're not part of the standard anymore. In the stand summary, there's a lot of technical changes to this about how we describe the forests that are being enrolled in the program. And I think the big picture here is that a lot of this is already being provided by plan preparers. A lot of this is specific to certain enrollment categories, so subcategories. So for example, course woody material is not required for every enrollment category. So for productive forest land, nobody needs to provide coarse woody material, but coarse woody material is really important for old growth characteristics or old forest characteristics. And so of course that plan requirement is required whenever reserve forest land is being enrolled or whenever land is being enrolled in the old forest ESTA category. Some other areas where we are requiring it across the board are related to the browse index. There hasn't been a specific way to communicate the degree to which browse is occurring, deer browse is occurring on enrolled forest land, and that's a real barrier to successful management. And if it's occurring intensively, one management approach may be the right thing to do in one scenario, but in another with a different level of browse, you may need to choose a totally different approach. And so having that kind of information that informs the appropriate management is really valuable. Another really important one that we're adding here is UVA treatment history. And folks know that land enrolled in the program needs to implement the management activity prescribed in the plan and needs to not implement other activity not prescribed in the plan. Unfortunately, we've had some scenarios where plans are being submitted that don't clearly address either what was prescribed or what was implemented in the previous plan, and it makes it hard to address trends. Sometimes we get 3 plans in a row where management has been prescribed for 30 years and never been implemented. And when that's occurring, that's not consistent with the requirements of the program, and either more realistic prescriptions need to get included in the program, or that landowner needs to be more accountable to implementing the activity. And this is not to create a trigger, but to create some transparency for, hey, if something was prescribed and it wasn't done, let's get it on the table and make a plan to get it implemented. Or maybe there's a rationale. For instance, an area that was all white ash, but was and prescribed for treatment, but was subsequently killed by emerald ash borer. Conditions change, and maybe what was appropriate in the last plan cycle isn't appropriate today. That can get on the table very clearly here. There are a lot of clarified and expanded examples in the stand summary, and there are some aspects that are removed. In the management objectives section of the plan, there's just minor clarifications. This is for an individual stand. What are the objectives for that? For example, in a sugar bush, you're managing for sap production. In a productive forest land stand, you're going to be managing for saw timber. There's only minor clarifications in that section. In the prescriptions, we've clarified how to articulate a description, a prescription in a more consistent kind of modular way. This helps ensure that all the details are required, or all the details that are required are included in the plan. It looks like a lot. I was just talking to a consulting forester today who was looking at the plan prescription details and saying, at first it felt a little overwhelming until I just did a trial run on a prescription and ran through it and only required a few elements from the prescription. And so what you're seeing in some of these sections of the standards is the full list of anything that might be required, but in many cases, not everything is required. And so there are some supporting tables that are referenced in the standards that help articulate some of this stuff. And so why are these changes included? Many of these changes have been included because we found that these elements are already being included in plans, and they're really helpful for ensuring effective communication and creating shared expectations. That they're really valuable for consideration of the efficacy of the prescription. For instance, if somebody is looking to regenerate a stand and we don't know about the invasive plants or the deer browse, it's really hard to understand if that's going to really be successful in regenerating the stand. And so we need to make sure that we have the information about the presence or the absence of these major factors that are going to affect success. These elements are going to strengthen our confidence, and I think our ability to convey confidence that UVA is advancing the statutory goals of the program. And again, going back to the cost of the program, I think that's going to be particularly important in the coming years. And these changes will exchange unstructured narratives for succinct statements in the program. The plans can be more efficient, concise, and direct, and I think that can be a benefit to both landowners and ideally plan preparers and their efficiency of plan preparation, but also in the plan review process. So in terms of impacts to landowners, there are benefits and there are costs here. And so for the individuals, there's less ambiguity and smoother approvals for folks is our goal. There's more defensible enrollment and fewer surprises. There's more plan clarity, but not more prescriptive management requirements. And so when you have a forest management plan, you know exactly what's required because it's very clear and precise, but the changes in the standards aren't adding or aren't constraining the kind of silviculture that can occur on the property. As I mentioned before, this has the potential to lay the groundwork for self-certification by licensed foresters. I think the important cost that's going to vary significantly across the state is potential impacts to costs for landowners. I've talked to a lot of foresters who have said, this isn't going to have an impact on cost. I do this work already. Maybe there's going to be a learning curve, but this is what we're doing, or it's a small change. I will stress that we made a big effort to make sure that this didn't increase the on-the-ground inventory or assessment, which is often the biggest cost associated with plan development. But this does change the details in the plan and the format. So again, there will be a learning curve. And in some cases, folks who are writing bare bones plans may have an increased cost. There's no standardization of costs, and so we're in a really difficult spot to estimate what that would be. But I do encourage landowners to reach out to their consulting foresters and talk to them about what the implications for these draft standards might be. And if there are conversations about implications, questions about specifics. What would make the difference to do this? Because as I mentioned, we're trying to strike a balance. Landowner costs is one of those things we're looking to strike. We're also looking to strike a balance with ease of administration and defensibility of the program and so on. And so it is a balancing act. Programmatically, landowners depend on a sustainable, strong program. And so while there may be impacts to individuals, the viability and sustainability of the program is something everybody depends on. And so consistent, equitable application of the program standards across the program is really important. This is going to improve on that. It's going to have improved environmental outcomes and measurable results. And that's going to help us defend and advocate for the program in important ways. It's going to create stronger defenses against abuse of the program and create more public confidence in program integrity. And so we think that that is going to be in the long-term interest of every landowner involved in the program. Wrapping up, our next steps are that landowner and forester outreach is going to occur through October 17th of this year. We'll compile input, the input received, we'll revise a draft. We'll bring that draft back to the Private Lands Advisory Committee in December, and our goal is to adopt a final draft in January of 2026. That adopted draft will not go into effect until April 2nd of 2026. That's after any of the 2026 updates are due. So nobody is going to have a moving target. Plans are already in preparation right now for 2026. Nobody's going to have a new set of standards that are imposed on them kind of mid-plan development. Between January and April, we'll be doing a lot of outreach with consulting foresters so that they're prepared to implement these standards and meet these standards when they do their first round of plan development for enrollments in 2028 and plan updates in enrollments in 2027 and plan updates in 2027. We've got we've had a couple of events. We had a landowner webinar yesterday, a forester webinar in August, and a in-person forester meeting in September, earlier September. We've got a couple of landowner in-person events coming next week and the following weeks. And we've got a recording here that's on the website from August 28th. That has a kind of line by line, maybe overstating. There are a lot of different specific standard changes that are articulated in the second half of that. And folks can watch that if they want to look at some highlighted examples of changes to the standards. And we are going to be sharing this recording. We'll post it on the website alongside the recording from August 28th. And we'll share that with all of you. And we'll share that. It'll be broadly available on the website. So in closing, we're looking for fair, effective, predictable delivery of the program. And your input can really help make that possible. So join one of the input sessions on September and October, or you can email your input to me at keith.thompson@vermont.gov. Use UVA Draft Standards Input 2025 as your subject line. That helps me organize all the input I'm receiving. And if you would, refer to the Clean Draft Standards document on the webpage. And refer to the line number when making changes or when making recommendations or comments. That helps me zero in on exactly what language is causing confusion and exactly where the solution might lie. As we go through 450 plus comments, having kind of a line by line accounting of where comments are coming from or where they're relevant is really helpful to incorporating all of them. And that is it. I really appreciate everybody's time.